Welcome to the Antler Crown podcast, where we discuss brews, witchcraft, spirituality, and more.
We hope through conversation we can continue the trend of the collective awakening or learn something new from ourselves or each other.
Today we'll be drinking some Yorkshire tea.
And then we're going to have some friends from the Patreon on, and we're going to talk to the author of Welsh Witchcraft.
So come on in. Welcome to the Antlered Crown podcast. Bonus episode. It said it in capitals.
I know. I thought you'd have some more emphasis since it said it in capitals. But
bonus episode.
That's perfect. Much better. Thank you.
I'm Elwyn, and I'm a fourth generational witch.
I'm Amanda, the mom writer. I'm so excited to speak to our guest, author of Welsh Witchcraft, Mhara Starling. Yay! Hello, Mhara. How are you?
Hello, I'm great, thank you. How are you today?
Oh, it's nice out though.
Nice day.
It's not snowing, so that's positive. I think we pre-ordered it, Mhara, because we were so excited when we saw that you had written a book and that it was about Welsh witchcraft because his mother is actually Welsh. And so he has history in Wales that he's never really dug into. So we were very excited to see you write this book, and congratulations.
Yeah.
Marvelous. Thank you. And I hope it lives up to the expectations as well.
Yeah. I was really excited to see how much of the lore you had included. I think that was really, that helped tie the book. Yeah, that helped tie the book in really nicely. And it was nice because you can't find very much information on Wales in particular or the lore.
No. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I decided to go down this path of writing it, because growing up on Anglesey and being immersed in the folklore and mythology of Wales, it was quite jarring to me when a bit of background information. I got into witchcraft when I was about 12 via my grandmother was a tea leaf reader and a crystal ball reader. So when I found a book in a charity shop that was all about spells, not long after she died, I was like, "Ooh, that's my nine. That's my grandmother. She did things like that, was witchy, so I'm going to connect with her." And at first, my witchcraft was very much what one would call very eclectic, very kind of mishmash of anything I could find in charity shops and such. And then I found Christopher Hughes and the Anglesey Druid Order. And Christopher kind of invited me into this world where the magical lore of Wales was infused into a land-based practice. And I was blown away by why do people not know about this? I remember he introduced me to the Mabinogi in a way that I hadn't been introduced to before. So these myths and legends that I grew up with, that I went to watch theatrical versions of and plays and things like this, I was like, oh my gosh, these can actually play a role in my practice. And these are things that are, I mean, they've been present in my life forever. And I can't believe it never dawned on me when I got into witchcraft initially that this could be a part of my practice. So a huge part of it for me was a frustration from when I was a teenager, and I was like, I can't find anything about witchcraft specifically written in Wales about Welsh traditions and such. And if you can find it, it's usually very academic, or it's very hard to find. It's very expensive and such. So I was like, you know what? If nobody's going to do it, I'm going to do it. And I took the charge, and it took a lot of convincing from friends and Christopher to finally tell myself that I was fine to do it, or good enough, because I think a lot of wannabe authors have that feeling of who cares what I have to say about this, what do I have to say about it? But after a lot of convincing, I finally did it, and I'm really proud of it, even if it isn't quite everything I'd like to get out there, but that's what other books are for in future. So.
There you go. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I enjoyed a lot. I actually, funnily enough, as I was reading it, at the very beginning of reading it, I remember years ago Googling Welsh witchcraft, just in general. And what would come up was a very strange, like, there wasn't much in it. It was primarily, you would just find forms of witchcraft that people practiced in Wales, but wasn't actually based around the lore of Welsh mythology or anything like that. I found it very difficult to find anything. And I think at the moment, it's really nice to see as well that this book, wherever I look, especially on TikTok, people have the book. And I think it's fantastic because it's one of these things that people are so intrigued about. And I think what you've done there is also you've kept this form alive, especially for Welsh practice and the mythology, which is fantastic as well. Yeah, no, I really enjoy that, especially. Also, what I will say is I enjoyed also there's parts within the book that you incorporate about your journey and how your craft has changed and evolved and the lessons that you have learned from it, whether it be more like quite profound experiences like with the lady in that sense, or just through conversation with others. But they're these milestones that change things and alter things. And I think a lot of people get stuck and a bit bogged down in their craft because they stick to that. And if something changes within them, if something changes about their practice, they panic and like, oh no, because what does that mean? I think that's primarily because of this form of like many people in the way of that they see religion now is that you're not supposed to change it. You're not supposed to have a different opinion about something. Whereas it can create a problem for people when they're during their craft, during their practice. It all of a sudden what they knew then is not the same now. I think that's really important message in the book as well, because it's reassuring for lots of other people. I think,
Yes, I think it's always important to root. So one of the lessons that I was taught when I was growing up and coming from paganism in the vein of like I started as a teenager and had all these like beautiful mentors who helped me along the way, people who were I don't know, were kind enough to give me some of their knowledge, and I'm very privileged to have that. But one of the lessons I really cemented into myself from some of those people who really helped me on my practice and on my craft was that everything should be rooted in the now, and everything should be rooted in where you are at this moment in time and not stuck in any kind of part. And that came in kind of twofold, that lesson. It was a bit of a lesson in, that antiquity does not always equal authenticity, that something doesn't have to be ancient and old to be authentic. Something can be more modern, because I think with practices such as Welsh practices, Celtic practices in general, you will find that a lot of things you think are very, very old and ancient and based in the past are actually not as old as you thought. And learn that like, oh, actually this came from this 19th century person who was a bit of an eccentric, and now we look at it as if it's something that's really cemented in the ancient Celtic past. And you have to accept that no, that's not the case. If you look at it historically, there's no evidence to prove that. And so that was a huge like cornerstone in my practice, where I had to accept that just because something's old or ancient does not mean it's more authentic, and just because something's new does not mean that it's less valuable within your practice. And I think I tried to incorporate that into every like realm of my practice as well. So when I came to moments where everything that I knew was challenged and I needed to kind of dissect my practice and go, oh, do I actually still believe this then, if that's the case? I, rather than kind of collapsing and going, I don't know what I think anymore, I took it as a challenge and went, yeah, I'm going to like figure this out and learn more and go deeper into this topic and figure out what exactly are my thoughts on it and how does it fit into where I am now. And I'm glad that you said that, because I hope that that comes through. And even looking at the book today, I remember I was talking to a friend who's also an author the other day, And she was saying, it's nearly the 10th year anniversary of my first book now. And if I wrote that book today, I would write it completely differently because that's not how I view that topic anymore. And I turned to her and I said, my book's not even a year old yet. And I still think that about mine. I'm like, there are things in here that I was literally reading through it the other day because I was doing something and I stopped and I went, oh, I don't agree with that. And then I had to think, wait, this is my book. But yeah, it's just a snapshot into your practice. And I think people could really do with like remembering that even books are just a snapshot into one tiny moment in an author's practice or in a witch's practice, and that things should always constantly evolve and change. And if we go along with that change, then we're firmly rooted in the here and now and not constantly stuck in something that we are just doing out of habit. So I hope that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. Mhara, I wanted to talk to you. You described the witch as a complex archetype and simultaneously feared and revered. So I wanted to see what you believed were the defining characteristics of a witch.
Oh, that's an interesting one, because I think coming at it from a purely Welsh perspective, this was something that like was really challenging for me when I was writing the book, because the Welsh have a very specific perception of a witch, and it's very different to a lot of other areas, even to England. We share a border with England. We're attached to England, so much so that people think often that we're the same entity, that England and Wales are just one country. But even when you look at the little differences in how the Welsh viewed witches to how the English did historically, there's such a variation. And obviously I had to like keep in mind, I'm a modern day person with modern day views of what these things are. And I grew up in the era of, when witches were becoming superheroes on our screens. It was very rare that witches were portrayed in TV or media or in books as these haggard old women anymore. It was often like Harry Potter and The Worst Witch, where they were the heroines of the story. They were the people who were stepping into their power. So I think I had that view of a witch growing up, and I always loved the image of the witch in general, because growing up as someone who was often bullied and often kind of left to the side and dealt with a lot of trauma, I often saw the witch as this embodiment of empowerment, as this kind of like this figure who is standing in their own power and is still weird, is still kind of on the sidelines of society, but they don't care. They're just living their truth and living their power. And so I grew up viewing the witch like that. And then I kind of started delving into the folklore of the witch within the context of the culture that I grew up in. And I started realizing little things such as when you look at medieval or early modern folklore surrounding witches in England, for example, it's very straightforward about the fact that witches are usually malevolent in nature. And then you come to Wales, and there isn't even really a word in our language outside of folklore and mythology to describe a witch of that nature. We didn't even have a word in the courts. So when women were, or men sometimes as well, were accused of witchcraft, there wasn't a word that they could use in the native language to describe that. So they would just say wits. And I think that says a lot about how the Welsh felt about witches. And I've had a lot of people come to me and say, well, what about gwrach? Like we have that word gwrach in the Welsh language that we use today. But when you actually delve into the older folklore of gwrachod, they tend to deviate. There are certain examples, such as Ceridwen, who is from the 16th century onwards referred to as a gwrach, who is just a woman who is empowered with knowledge of the hidden world and such. But other than that, gwrachod in a lot of folklore are these like monstrous creatures who are giants. Sometimes they have like animalistic features such as wings. So the concept of the witch as a woman or person with power who utilizes magic was not really something that was attributed to the gwrach figure so much. So I found it really fascinating to dive deep into that kind of rabbit hole of what did the Welsh think a witch was then, because we didn't have as many witch hunts. We didn't have a word for it when we did have, on the rare occasion, witch hunts. And so did the Welsh believe in witches at all? Even did they just see magic as this kind of neutral force and not good, not bad, just is? And that's kind of the what I came to at the end, was that magic was just seen as existing and not specifically good or bad. It could be used for good, could be used for bad, but it was kind of this just neutral force that existed, which is in keeping with what a lot of modern witches believe about magic as well, that there is no good or bad, it just is, and it depends on how you use it. And that was really transformative in my view of the witch in general. So when I think of witches now, I use my own personal definition mostly, where I see a witch as a complex creature of both fear and mystery, magic and wonder, who traverses that fine liminal line between absolutely terrifying and absolutely mesmerizing at the same time. And witchcraft, to me, as a person who did overcome a lot of trauma and pain and fear and bullying, is an act of empowerment. So it's a way for me to take back and reclaim my own power. And so the witch, to me, kind of straddles that place of pure intrinsic power. And that's kind of the image I try and draw upon. So when I call myself a witch, I draw upon that image of someone who is empowered and stands in their power and says, this is me, and you can deal with it or you can leave my space. As my friend Christopher was saying the other day when we were talking, he was saying sometimes your light will shine so bright that other people will have a problem with that and they will ask you to dim down your light. And in my eyes, the witch does not dim down their light for anyone. They just tell you, you need to put on some sunglasses because I'm going to shine. So that's kind of my personal definition of a witch. And then I think the book as well delves into a little bit of the cultural context of what a witch is in the Welsh stream of things. But that's where I stand with what a witch is.
Yeah. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Cornwall kind of similar to Wales in that aspect? Because there was so much, Christianity being spread around. They at least had a little bit more separation from that, so they were able to keep more.
Cornwall, although part of England, there was this thing of like, it was very, as we spoke about before, it wasn't easy to get to certain parts of Cornwall. Yeah. Similar in the same way as Wales in many ways, I suppose, especially for the Romans, and bloody Romans. What have they ever done for us? But and there is this certain thing. There's this. I think one of the things in Cornwall that is different in some forms is that there's been a huge demonization in that way. Like you were saying with Welsh, the Welsh don't have the word for, which is one of the things I've noticed is a pattern when this enigma of how things are perceived by not just modern times, but also ancient Celtic people. For instance, like that of death and the underworld. It's such an enigma, even to us and to people who were experiencing it and writing about it even back then. They were just like, I don't fully understand. Like it's so parallel to them. It's part of their daily life in that way, which another reasons why the Romans didn't like it, because there was nothing to fear in death for many of the ancient Celts, because they were just like, well, it's fine. I'll just die, and it's just not a problem. So yeah, I think in that sense, Cornwall does have certain affiliations in that way, because Cornish, they have this independence that they have, and this pride in their own language and their land. This is similar, and I think that's one of those things that is also carried through, and that they try and use in the form of their practices. You live in a place where it's difficult; it's not very accessible like the rest of the country. Therefore, I think naturally, people, tellers, wise people, cunning folk, practitioners, they're the people who you're going to go to help you with things. Because you're living in a place that's fairly cut off in that sense, and I think that's
so interesting.
One of the reasons why it survived more than in England, because in England it's just like, oh well, it's just
London went first. Is that what you're saying? JK. Real quick, Courtney said, not a question, but I just love the way Mhara describes her craft as what feels like almost a living, breathing thing that grows and changes. And I appreciate the way you articulated that snapshot, since I feel the same. Thanks, Courtney. Charlie, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. So first of all, let me just say this is such a cool opportunity um, to be here and have this discussion. So something Elwin and I have discussed a few times is the presence of different Christian aspects and themes and things in different folk practices. Um, and I know that Mara covered it briefly in the book. And as an Appalachian folk practitioner, there's a lot of that Christian influence in the history of this practice. But as someone who was raised evangelical and has only recently, within the past couple of years, come out of the church and severed my connection with Christianity, I struggle with discomfort when it comes to the Christian aspects of the different folk practices. So my question is, what advice would you give someone who's coming out of Christianity and into witchcraft or paganism that is struggling with the Christian aspects that are found in many of the different folk traditions?
I love this because it's something that I think a lot of people struggle with, and I have had a few messages, comments, and such since the book came out that said such things such as like, you incorporate too much Christian ideas and concepts into your book, and it triggers me a little because I know some people have come from a background where the church did not leave a very good impact on them. I think I'm coming from a really strange place where I didn't have any religion growing up, so I didn't really view it in that way. But yeah, it's a huge aspect of folk magic. I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the folk magic that inspires and informs modern witchcraft today comes from a period in time when most people would have been Christian. And so there will be aspects of Christianity in those folk magical practices. And that can be really jarring, especially if, for example, I know that a few friends who I have here in Chester, they struggled with it in my book because they come from a background where Christianity is something they left behind and hopefully turned to paganism to gain some new view of spirituality and such. And to see those elements again is a bit like, ooh, do I really want to dive down that road again? But the way I always see it is that it was the magic of the people, and the people created and crafted what they needed for themselves. So they would incorporate things that were familiar to them, that were easy for them. I remember I was reading a folktale not too long ago about, it was a rewritten version of a folktale. So it wasn't something old or ancient, but it was something that was rewritten in about 2011 by a specific author, where this man goes to see a wise woman and she stands up and is about to do a spell or a charm for him. And he's instantly soothed by the fact that she calls upon Christian concepts. And I know that that was kind of like a novelization of what would have happened, but I feel like that might have played a role in some parts of the country where maybe the idea or concept of the witch as this diabolical satanic figure might have trickled in, where it was like, oh, I'm going to this person who basically fits the description of what a witch is. What are they going to do? What are they going to make happen? And then for them to then stand up and use names such as God or the Virgin Mary, I think it would have given some of the people, the common folk who went to these people, a sense of security because that was their faith. That was something that was behind them. And I know that some authors within the regions of folk magic do talk about that, how it's more for the client, because a lot of witchcraft or folk magic, not witchcraft specifically, that we look at historically was very much a trade. It was something that people did for a living. It was something that they did to help and serve the community and also to just survive. They got money for it or they get food for it. And so it was mainly like people first. So even if some of these people, these eccentric characters who we know from history were these wise people and cunning folk, even if they maybe had a different view of how the world operated to the church, it was still a focus on, well, I'm serving the people and I need to serve them for their needs. And so I always view it like that in a historical context. I'm like, okay, maybe it was mostly just done for the people that it was being done for, and also the people who practiced it probably did believe more so in Christianity as well. When I look at it today, I see it more as a guideline. So I recently wrote a little something on Twitter, I think, talking about how I think some people misunderstand books sometimes when we're talking about, this is a spell from antiquity, this is a charm or a piece of folk magic that people did in the past, and this is what they would do and the words that they would speak. There you go. And I think some people sometimes look at that and they go, oh, so if I want to do this, I have to recreate it exactly as it is. And that's definitely not how I see it. I always see it as that is a baseline, then. That's a guideline right there. That is something to look at and go, okay, so my ancestors, when they were doing magic, this is how they did it. How can I incorporate that into my life today? And so I will alter words, I will change things around, I will use different symbols if need be, and use things that work for me. Or if I'm working with a client or something, use things that would work best for them. But I also have found recently that I just enjoy looking into the kind of different perspective on Christianity, looking at it from the perspective of, I see that there's like the body of Christianity, which is the church and the powers that be, and the almost like kind of oppressive force that could be for some people, especially if like you're a minority or something like that. You can look at the church as this almost oppressive entity and forget that there was also the folk Christianity, the Christianity of the people who just viewed it as their everyday faith. And looking at it from that perspective of like the working class people who just lived their everyday life and found comfort and joy out of their faith, I think has helped me move away from that and see the mysticism and magic that exists in that faith, even if I have problems or traumas with the certain words that are used. And I don't know if that helps at all, but those are kind of two ways that I come about it. Is that, number one, I see it more as a baseline for inspiration. So these are spells and magical practices that can inspire my practice. And also, it was a different time and different people, and even if it doesn't work for me, it's still beautiful to see how it works for other people. So I hope that kind of helps, and I just like the historical context behind it all too.
No, that helps a tremendous amount. Thank you. That really also rings with something else that you said in your book that really, really, really struck me and that stuck with me, is the idea of taking things from antiquity and making them your own today. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
It reminded me actually, I was a couple of years ago, I was looking at a book on charms. I can't remember what the book was. It was on Amazon. And I was reading the reviews, as you do. You read the reviews. I go through the reviews and I read. And one of the reviews said, talks too much about God. That's all they said. Talks too much about God. Don't like it. And I was like, well, that's because they're like old charms, but what you said there about putting other people at ease, I think that was a huge part of it. That idea of what you say and what you mean are two different things. And it is that. I think that's what we talked about before. My aunts never would have described themselves as witches, because even then it wasn't something, people wouldn't come to you. And yet everything that they did was witchcraft. So, there is this thing, I think now it's different.
It is, but it isn't, because you still have, the breed of love and light and spiritual workers and light workers that I think cater to more Christian concepts.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't no bullshit. I mean, it does.
No, you're right.
So I think it's still out there. And if anything, I think that's where a lot of people feel most comfortable at first. I know we talked to Morgane, and Morgane initially came into the craft. I mean, her dad, he's a monk, right?
He's a monk.
He's a monk. So,
I think he's a Tao monk or a Taoist monk.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Is he or is he not? Am I wrong there? Is he a Benedictine monk or something?
Baby,
he's a monk. He's a monk.
Morgan's gonna be like,
What?
But yeah, I just find that really interesting that like a lot of people get their start there and then they reflect upon that and they're like, interesting the path that I've fallen through, and that they can't even believe that that's where they started out at.
Certainly.
So
Certainly. I think that's part of the evolution. It's a, you know how they talk about gateway drugs. I think it's the same way. It's, you know, certain.
Then there's
certain,
astrology, and then you just
certain,
follow that.
That's
this
it.
path.
That's it. Someone says, "Would you like this?" Or you see a piece of amethyst while walking down the road one day in the shop window. Next thing you know,
Gateway drugs,
that's it.
gateway
You're away.
witchcraft.
Next thing, within a month's time, you've got a giant Baphomet statue in the corner.
Mara's like, wait a minute.
Just looking at my 2 Baphomet statues, like, oh yeah, that's where they came from.
Courtney said, next thing you know, there's a cow heart in your freezer. Dang, Courtney, called out.
I've been called out for that.
Just a few,
just
in case.
I actually forgot that was still in there.
Well, we haven't needed it lately.
No, it's nice.
Yeah. Okay. How do you feel about Celtic paganism being considered a closed or open practice?
You had to
diving into the hard questions. I love it.
Gosh, I always so I get this question a lot, especially
okay,
because on TikTok, because I do some things on TikTok, I suppose, and because of that, like I've had a lot, and that's like a huge area of discourse over on TikTok is what is or isn't a closed practice, and it's almost like every other week something else is closed, but that might be too shady to say, but
no, you're right.
It's true.
It's really interesting to me because I can only really to be sensitive about it, I always say I can only really speak for Wales because that's my background and my cultural kind of context. So I would never say, Ireland is an open, Irish paganism is an open practice or Scottish paganism.
Yeah.
But for me, personally, I definitely see Welsh paganism, Welsh Celtic paganism, or Welsh folk magical practices and such, and which could inspire a witchcraft practice. I see them as open, but, and there's a caveat to that, I always say, I think it's open, but it's important to remember the cultural context of these practices and remember where they come from and have respect and reverence for that culture. And not just for the culture, but also for the fact it still exists. So it's something I talk about a lot. People use the word Celtic to denote something old, ancient, mystical, fantastical, and forget that the Celtic peoples are still here. They still exist and they still live day-to-day lives with actual problems in the Celtic nations right now that they're facing, with politics of their own, with identities of their own. The language is still being spoken widely across Wales nowadays. And I think sometimes, I don't know, this might sound very rude and horrible of me, but when I'm scrolling through different social medias or reading certain books written by certain authors, I think, oh my gosh, this person's talking about being a Celt as if it's Merida from Brave by Disney. And it's like, so do they just think that we're all running through the woods on horseback, like with our big curly red hair, chasing will-o'-the-wisps and running into fairies at every corner? And that can sometimes come across a bit tone deaf to me. Like it can be almost like, are you forgetting that we're real people and not, Lord of the Rings or something? And that's where I draw my caveat. I'm like, you have to remember that we are real people, that we exist to this day. And maybe as a sign of respect, if you're incorporating Welsh practices into your life and you've never stepped foot in Wales and you've never had any connection to this landscape other than through magic and witchcraft, I always recommend that people either learn a little bit of the language to try and keep it alive, either like, if they can't do that, then maybe read up a little bit on things such as independence movements and how like different nations in the Celtic nations are currently trying to rally for independence and what is the politics going on there. Do some people agree? Do some, like, just educate yourself a little bit on the current climate of what it means to be Welsh or Scottish or Irish, and listen also to native voices when it comes to what they believe about their practices and such, because I think living in the land can give quite a different context to these practices than being like millions, thousands of miles away. I always say to people, one of my favorite things about Wales, growing up in Wales specifically, was the folkloric and the mythological landscape that I grew up in, because when I talk to some of my friends who live over in Australia or in America, to them, a lot of the stories that are so near and dear to my heart from our folklore mythology, those are, once upon a time in a land far, far away for them. But for me, it was like, oh no, that was down the road. That was down there. Like that was in that field by my house. And so it feels much closer. And I think just having that, and especially if you speak the language and you interact with the culture on a daily basis, it can give you a different context. So I always tell people, listen to native voices even if you don't like them, because it will still give you a little context into what it means today to be Celtic or Welsh or however you want to define it. But yeah, it's a strange one, because I always reference history. When the Welsh moved and migrated from Wales, they took their practices with them and they shared them with the people that they met. They shared their songs, they shared their stories, and they mingled with the cultures that they met up with. And that's apparent in places like in Appalachia, where you do have this mixture of cultures, and you can see the Irish or the Scottish or the Welsh or even the Cornish influence in places that are literally over an entire ocean away. And so it's apparent that these things carried on and were taken to different people and were fused with different things. And so I always see it like that. It's that migration of the storytelling and making it relevant to you and who you are now, but always stay relevant to what the cultural context of those practices are. Oh, and one other thing, this is just me being a bit of a bit nasty now. I think like this comes from a place of personal like insult because of something that happened a few weeks ago.
Oh, no.
But I personally, like, I don't mind it when people take on Celtic paganism or Welsh paganism or call themselves a Welsh witch, even if they live over in America or something. But what I absolutely hate is when people come on and they try and argue with you about what it means to be Welsh or the experience of what it is to be Welsh today, or try and argue something about the Welsh language, and they've never even stepped foot out of like Minnesota or something. It's a bit like,
it would be Minnesota.
Damn. Oh, gosh. But yeah, that's kind of my only that's where I get uncomfortable, is when I get someone coming into my space like, I'm a Welsh witch and I practice Welsh witchcraft, and this is how Welsh witchcraft is, and your book is incorrect because of this. And then I dig a little deeper and it's like, this person was born in New Jersey and never left New Jersey. So like, how do they, I don't know. That might just be me being rude and nasty, but
no, that's fair.
That's where I draw the line.
Like, also the fact that they probably like, living in England, Welsh people, the one thing you know is Welsh people are incredibly proud people.
Yeah.
They fought tooth and nail for centuries to remain, to keep their culture and who they are. So yeah, no, I completely agree with you. That I wouldn't say that was mean of you at all in any way. That's no, most definitely. I think that's, as a matter of fact, that's one of the things that, as we were saying about this, the whole closed thing, if something is closed, then you run the risk of limiting its coverage, that, it can't grow, it cannot be sustained in some ways as it would be before. And yet, when it comes to magic, it's a very difficult thing, I think, because primarily there are things that, I think this is one of those things, is that we come to our own conclusions of things, and there's the forms of hidden knowledge that we find out for ourselves through our own experiences, that make it very difficult, especially when you're trying to be respectful to other people's cultures, other people's things, but at the same time you have how do we pick the difference between those people who basically want to on the outfit of something, because it's, as you said, their idea of it, like in like Merida in Brave, the romanticized version of what it is. And then there are those people who are genuinely interested, and for whatever reason, it's very difficult to find the line sometimes for each individual, you know. Yeah, I think it's a tough one, isn't it? It is a tough one.
Yeah. Courtney said it's about honor and respect. So valid. Courtney said, I also feel that if as someone is a cunning person and they attempt to use a closed practice and it is truly closed, it won't work for them and they will feel that. I agree. Yeah. That's very true. Very fair.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
You all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to read that last one? Unless you had another question in your mind.
No. This is the one. Yeah. Okay. Do you believe there is a conception that ancient witchcraft is more powerful or popular than newer witchcraft? Is there a stigma attached to, quote, traditional witchcraft?
Oh, definitely. So it's not so much that, oh gosh, how do I voice and word this? I think sometimes people, it's like I was saying earlier about the concept of antiquity equals authenticity, and I wrote about it in the book as well, how people seem to have this belief that the older something is, the more valid and real it is, and therefore the more valuable it is to our practice. And I really struggle with that because there's a lot of very modern concepts in spirituality that really work for me. And if it works, then shouldn't that be the main thing that we look to, rather than, well, this is old, so this should be the one you do instead because it's older. So I really struggle with the idea that something being older or more ancient is more real. But at the same time, I do refer to myself as a folk witch or sometimes a traditional witch because I draw upon the streams of tradition that exist within the culture that I grew up in. I draw upon it and it informs and inspires my practice. But I think one needs to, if one does have this admiration for things that are older and traditional in nature, one has to like sit there and go, what does tradition even mean? What does traditional even mean to me in my practice? Because when I refer to myself as a traditional witch or as a folk witch, the first question I ask myself in tradition when it comes to traditional is, well, what do I mean by that? Does it mean that I'm some ancient witch who has like drawn down power from the Middle Ages or something onwards? And that I'm part of some unbroken lineage of ancient hereditary witches.
Right.
And the truth of that is no. My one side of my family, my grandmother went to church every Sunday, and the other side of the family, my grandmother used to do tea leaf readings and crystal ball readings. But other than that, she just lived on a farm and ran an ice cream van. So it was like, no, I don't have heredity. But I refer to myself as a traditional witch because I view the traditions of magic and witchcraft that emanate from the culture in which I grew up in as the main source of inspiration for my practice. And I think that word is really important, inspiration. I'm not trying to copy it. I'm not trying to reconstruct what those people were doing in like the 1500s, the 1600s. I'm just inspired by it and informed by it. And I think these practices deserve being recorded and being acknowledged and remembered, because a phrase you hear a lot in paganism, what is remembered lives. So long as we remember these practices and bring them forth, then it's preserving a lot of the culture of Wales. And I look to the old charms of the country that I grew up in, and there's this amazing narrative, almost bardic quality to our charms, and it sparks so much within me that inspires my own personal way of weaving words in magic. And that doesn't mean that I'm following exactly what they did, it just means that it truly inspires me, and I love reading about the history of it and learning about it in order to inspire and inform what I do today. But it's also deeply important to me that I remember that I am here, I am this, I am a modern person in a modern world, and I need to take into context like what's going on around me, because I think if we try and emulate the past constantly, then we're not going to live authentically, because we're not living in who we are right now. And when I refer to myself as a folk witch as well, I often like wonder, what does that exactly mean? Because a lot of people refer to themselves as a folk witch just because they really like the folklore and the imagery that is associated with traditional witchcraft. But a question that I got asked really early on in my practice that has stuck in my brain is, if you're calling yourself a folk witch, who are your folk? Who are those folk that you're referring to? Because the folk witch, if we're looking at what a folk witch is in the context of how we look at it now, and the term that we ascribe to these people who operated as cunning folk and wise women in the past, or people who aided the community in some way, they had folk that they took care of. They were part of the community. They were integral to the communities that they served. What are we doing to have that label? So it's why it's important to me that I run all sorts of things in my local community. So I currently run various classes and events, and I try and bring a community together. I run public moots. So I try and build community within it and also be part of the community that I'm in and serve the greater community, because otherwise I feel like I'm not allowed to call myself a folk witch if I don't do that, because who are my folk if I'm just reading the folklore? And I think those things have been integral to my practice as a traditional witch or a folk witch. And some people can get really snippy about that because they assume that by those terms you mean that you are some 18th generation witch whose line goes back to the witches of Pendle.
Right. Yeah.
It can get really frustrating.
They take issue with that, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. I got into a lot of trouble when I made a TikTok that I said that there is no such thing as traditional witch. And everyone was like, how dare you? Kind of missed the point. Like, in the words of traditional magic, we may draw, as you said, the inspiration from it. But in truth, we are not the same people. We do not think the same. It's not like we don't have to get up and the worries of our lives aren't if our crops are going to fail because we will not be able to survive the winter. We can get in a car and drive for hundreds of miles, whereas before it would have taken us months. Things like this. We're not the same. We don't think the same as those people did. So therefore, our outlook and the way we perceive magic and is different. So I think that's what I meant. But it got, like everything, it gets misconstrued. It's just the natural way of it, isn't it?
Yeah. Charlie's right. You just like upsetting the apple cart on purpose.
A little.
Oh my goodness. Well, Mhara, is there anything you want to promote?
Oh, well, if I'm given the opportunity.
Absolutely.
So if anybody would like to catch up on a little bit more of Welsh witchery and such and magic, then obviously you can find me through my social media pages. I have pretty much everything: YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and all that different stuff. And my book, of course, is out now. But one thing I really want to talk about, if people aren't aware of it, is that I actually started my own podcast last week, the Welsh Witch Podcast. The first episode is already out, and it was a conversation with Christopher Hughes about finding Welsh magic, how one would glean inspiration from the traditions and folkloric elements of magic and incorporate it into a modern day practice. And it was a really intriguing chat with Christopher, because being the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order, an author, and somebody who also grew up in North Wales, it was just nice to talk to someone who is deeply rooted in that practice and is also someone that I deeply admire and look up to as a friend. So it was lovely to sit down and chat with that. But the Welsh Witch Podcast will explore various aspects of Welsh magic, folklore, mythology, and I am really excited because some episodes will be interviews like that one where I'm talking to someone. Others will be more just me chatting and saying, let's explore this folktale and maybe see how it might be incorporated into your practice if you're a witch, and really dissecting these things. And yeah, that's out now and available to listen anywhere. And yeah, if anybody would like to look into that, I'm really excited about it.
Yeah.
Oh, Courtney said, this was so wonderful, Mhara. Thank you. You were one of the first witch talkers I found, and I appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, you can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram as The Antlered Crown. You can join our Patreon or follow us on the Antlered Crown podcast, which hopefully you're listening to if you found this clip.
Most likely. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Yeah.